going to focus on very simple matter, which is about harmonization of tax and providing how best can we strengthen domestic revenue mobilization and the fiscal social contract. And in this regard, sorry, how do I do this? Okay. So the outline of my presentation goes as thus. So we're just going to review what domestic revenue mobilization is, vis-a-vis the Southeast. Ike also did a lot of justice in providing some of the context around this. Then we'll look at how best do we strengthen this fiscal social contract regarding our region, as well as the central vision for 2050 with regards to how best do we deepen the capital, how best do we strengthen our resolve in financing and providing the necessary structures around how those finances can be structured and best be utilized. So quite quickly, I think the point is, so quite quickly, we just glance through this part of the presentation, which deals with revenue mobilization, domestic revenue mobilization. I think some of the slides that I presented showed us the capacity and also the inabilities from the various states. We saw clearly how some of these things can be generated and what the capacity various states and various verticals towards raising those capital can bring. So what is DRM basically? It is not just about raising taxes. It's about broadening the tax base. It is also about creating structures that help to formalize the informal economy. We saw from the previous slides the various economic activities that do happen in various parts and various states of the southeastern states. But how best have we been able to harmonize these things? So which is what leads us to creating the structures around domestic revenue mobilization. In part, what it does drive is about sustainability and turning those economic activities into sustainable investment framework and structures. And to do that, it requires a sense of independence. It requires a sense of planning. It requires a deep sense of trust. Without independence, really, you can't actually plan. Without that planning, you can't build the trust. So the reality, and of course, what I see the SCDC doing is creating an enabling environment for these things to operate. Next slide, please. And you look at the overview of the Southeast economy, and I think I did a fantastic job again. Pardon me, I'm going to be calling him a couple of times because he's also a pathfinder in this path. But he provided a fantastic introduction into this. So my slide looks at the 2024, the Southeast were just barely lagging behind the Southwest and the South-South in terms of IGR. And we also saw from that previous slide that he did about Enugu State generating 181 billion. And when you look at Enugu vis-a-vis other Southeastern states, you find out that they may have been economically or commercially disadvantaged, but what is shown is the discipline upon which they have thrived to develop their IGR. So coming from something around 200 to where they are, so I mean about 27 billion to where they are at 181 billion shows you that the commitment and leadership actually helps to drive or to provide domestic revenue mobilization. My next slide, we're talking about how best do we strengthen domestic revenue mobilization. On the one end is broadening the tax base. And this is about how do we assemble the small and medium-scale enterprises into the tax base. The good thing with the harmonization of the new tax laws and the kickoff of the new tax administration in January, there's been a lot of formalization into how best taxes can be harmonized, how best it can provide the basis upon which growth and domestic revenue mobilization can be harnessed. And of course, digitization of the revenue system. I understand and I knew quite well firsthand when a sense of discipline is provided within a state. Enugu has done that, Anambra has done that, Abia has done that, Imo did that in the past. But what it shows is that once it's digitized, it removes a sense of arbitrariness. it removes a sense of opaqueness and provides a platform through which revenues can then be harnessed for the greater good, for the social contract that is being established. Of course, rationalization and exemption of various incentives. There are new businesses through which SEDC can actually drive some of those incentives that will help to mobilize local capital. Institutional capacity and governance, and I think that is why it's very necessary. A couple of weeks ago, Mark and I have been talking about how he's gotten his executive directors and his team in helping to create a very strong ecosystem that drives accountability, capacity, and of course innovation towards how best these structures can be done. And of course, most of you would know, or most of you may not know, that the Southeast Development Commission hasn't actually received their allocation. But what they've done with the little resources they've had is to build the capacity, to deepen their resolve in driving structured investment policies. When we look at the fiscal social contract, I think I provided a virtual cycle which is about government accountability, which is about visible service delivery and increased tax compliance. When government provides a sense of direction and accountability, they build trust. By doing this, the first thing I think the government should do, and the regional government or state government, is to provide some sense of accountability, transparency, through which citizens can then believe, to think that they have a hand in planning and driving the revenue mobilization structures. With this, you see infrastructure project. There's visibility around healthcare improvement, education, and digital public service. I talked about it as well. And you look at the increased tax compliance, because when it goes this cycle, what it then now does is broaden the tax base, it lowers enforcement costs, and provides sustainable revenue. When we move further a bit, we see how best do we strengthen the fiscal social contract. There's been a lot of lack of trust. There's also been a lot of apprehension. But when these two things meet together, it provides a lackadaisical approach towards how best this can be driven. So what is our reality today? In the southeastern region, we know that entrepreneurship and trading activities drive most of our economic activities. There's also a very high sense of reliance and investment. Everybody, most of us are entrepreneurs, traders. A few of us, work on the other part, but then you still have a couple of things that you do informally. What this then now does is there's a whole low trust in government, whereby the individuals and communities provide security for themselves, provide basic amenities, education, healthcare, and all of that. So they decide that how best would they be paying taxes if those taxes are not best utilized. And then you look at that leads to a poor tax transparency, because nobody likes to pay tax. Everybody wants to figure out how best do I circumvent this process and still benefit from what it is. And then there's a weak service linkage. That is the reality we have today. But then, what does that do? It weakens our trust. Of course, with a high informal sector, businesses are run outside the tax net. Then that makes it difficult for you to mobilize the necessary revenue domestically. Low compliance, there's an incentive for them not to comply. Private solutions, because communities now go into various ways. I remember in my younger days, my dad used to tell me a story of how they contributed money to build the Imo airport. Now, that sense of responsibility, on the one hand, is good, and on the other hand, also has a challenge where they feel that they don't have any responsibility towards what government is doing. But then therein lies the opportunity. The opportunity is for government to commit to a fair and transparent tax administration system. This will drive local service delivery. And of course, citizens would ensure that they voluntarily comply towards tax. Dividends of compliance would then now provide social welfare and benefit. But why does it matter so much? Sorry, go back to the last slide. Why does it matter so much? What it does, we saw the numbers that Ike showed. Because of the IGR. Because once there's compliance, once there's transparency, once there's accountability, and there's discipline, the IGR would grow. We've seen that from Enugu rising from 27 billion to 181 billion. It's not a wish. It was disciplined contribution. It was sense of governance. It was clarity of purpose. And what they then see is improved infrastructure. It was beautiful driving in yesterday night and looking at the roads. My colleague was telling me, is that how this place is? I said, wait until you get into the city. And you look at it and you find out that there's improved investors' confidence. I would like to come in and invest. This helps to drive and attract the right investment opportunities. And what you then now do is to ensure long-term planning for infrastructure investment. And if you look at the financial ecosystem, why does it matter for Vision 2050? What it does then do, it requires a sustained investment in infrastructure, human capital, governance system, social services over the long-term horizon. You know, when you look at the Southeast Development Commission, capital goes where there's trust. It goes where there's clarity. It goes where there's structure. I can opt to invest because I know Mark, my very good friend, has very structured discipline towards investment. My uncle Toby has, over the years, shown discipline and commitment towards how he does these things. My uncle Cliff Ogbede also has shown and demonstrated that. So I can go that. I can do that from a personal perspective. I could do that from my organization. But what it then does showcase, when you have this group of people inside and in one particular commission, it then now drives confidence, and confidence drives investment. So gentlemen and ladies, the Vision 2050 requires long-term delivery beyond political cycles. It's not just about APC, it's not about PDP, it's not about any of these institutions that don't matter. What matters is governance. And capital doesn't look at politics. Capital looks at returns. And where those returns are, that is where they're going to be driving their investment. You look at financing determines whether priorities move from plans to projects. And Mike and I have been discussing this over the last 1 year. How best do we mobilize this associated capital? I talked about blended finance. I think I'm going to touch a little bit on that later on. The scale of infrastructure and system investments in capital-intensive projects. I did mention about logistics and road. If you look at our collective road networks, the interconnectivities, they do exist. But when you look at intra-regional trade in the Southeast, it runs between 4 to 6%. This is absolutely abysmal. If you look at intra-African trade, it runs anything between 13 and 14%. You look at intra-European trade, 67 to 72%. And when you look at the intra-European trade, these are just states, really. Some of them are smaller than Anambra, some of them are smaller than Enugu, but then their trade within themselves runs between 67 and 70%. This goes to show that we can do a lot of things together. When you look at Anambra, look at Aba, look at Enugu, the contiguous trading system and businesses, they don't exist harmoniously. The Anambra man or the Enugu, or the Imo man or the Abia man rather would find a way to fly to Lagos to go and sell his goods and properties. And then Enugu suffers. How best do we harness those strengths and opportunities within ourselves? Mobilizing private capital development. Capital depends on credible public financing signals. And I think Southeast Development Commission has shown that signal. And I think what we need to do now, how do we deepen that resolve to make sure there's sustained growth and being able to attract the right investments into the space. Next slide, please. Priority areas. And I think we all know what they are: transport, health, human capital. But I think I'm going to touch and focus on only one, which is energy. Power is the highway upon which all infrastructure development ply. I talked about geometrics. I've been fortunate enough to work on that transaction for many years. Mr. Toby, you know very well how we worked on that. Mark, you know quite well how we worked on that. But how best do we strengthen and expand the opportunities that lies within geometrics? How do we use it to develop our state? How do we use it to develop our region? It can only be done through associations like the Southeast Development Corporation and Commission, strengthening that and expanding the potential opportunities to drive and attract capital. Then that is very, very important. Without power, it will be difficult for us to continue to develop as a people, as a region. Next slide. Financing framework for Vision 2050. 2050 will become a reality when there are clear plans, when there are clear structures around driving that dream. Now is a dream, but I believe it can be a reality. It can be a reality because we'll identify the funding sources, where the money comes from. Ike talked about institutional investors, private capital, public capital. And we can find this within the subnationals. We can find this through private institutions. Mark and I have been talking about where I used to work before the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. We looked at opportunity where we create capital for expanding and supporting sub-regional government. And we started to look at this where we would provide capital for project preparation. We've done this myself and InfraCredit, and we've done this in various blended approaches and structures to enable opportunities and infrastructure investments to come in. So this is where I see that those funding sources would come. Like I said, capital will go where there's opportunities and where there's clarity. And I think the signal is being set through events such as this, through commissions such as the SEDC. Domestic revenue as an anchor, because you put your hand where your mouth is or something like that. But then, because we're from the Southeast, we need to look at how best do we demonstrate for others to follow. So broadening the revenue base and formalization will strengthen the state and local revenue institutions to create discipline, really. Again, not to oversing it, Enugu created a strong discipline, which is why you see the rise and which is why you've seen the growth. And we've seen various or similar growth in various other parts of the nation. Digital and data-driven revenue system, capital mobilization and risk-sharing mechanism. Again, when you create a blended finance structure, it provides discipline around it. It helps to look at what are the risk matrices. How best do we allocate the risk? Credit risk, investment risk, infrastructure risk, operational risk. All of these things are looked in very critically. And which is why I talked about the project preparation facility. We created one, or rather we created two project preparation facilities, one with AfriExim. I know that SEDC has been talking to AfriExim in developing a project preparatory facility. And I think where I used to work, we have been having conversations around how best do we now deepen that pause to create various silos, sector by sector, and focusing on how best those project preparatory facilities can be deepened to be able to attract long-term capitals. And institutional sustainability. So aligning with Southeast Vision 2050, steering technical structures, which I know the committee, the commission is doing. But the issue around that is security. Insecurity is a major downer towards what we'll achieve as a people. And the reality for us is how best do we ensure that insecurity doesn't hamper the growth and development of the Southeast. And I think that is one of the key things that I've seen from this retreat in the last couple of days. I think there's a commitment, there's a demonstration that some of those key teaching issues that provide the elixir for investment to happen are being addressed. Next slide. I would rather leave this aspect because I think I've touched on that before. Let's go to the next one, please. And partnership and the role of SEDC. And I think I said it before. The key partnership, it lies in the demonstration that we've seen. So the Southeast Development Commission will serve as a regional investment partner of choice. And I think by the time they create and put themselves in a structured way that they have done, they will be able to attract the right partners, attract sovereign wealth institutions, attract the likes of Mofi. For Armstrong to be here, Ike to be here, InfraCredit to be here, shows you clearly that there is a demonstration, there's a path in the right direction. So that partnership is very much required. SEC is here. I know very well that all these gentlemen and women here are absolutely busy. They've been busy doing different things, but being here shows and signals a commitment to come in, to help to develop, to help to provide long-term capital, and to help to invest. And how do we then develop bankable projects? Again, I would not overemphasize it. Capital will go where there are bankability of projects. And how best do we provide bankable projects? Is to provide proper project development and project preparations for those projects. Because it's not about wishing, it's about deepening the resolve to invest in those long-term infrastructure. It's not a wish, it's a reality. And then data for market intelligence. One of the things all of us know here is the development institutions, the donor partners, and investors like data. And data cannot be hidden as far as it's fact-checked. And this data is where donor funding, diaspora investment institutions will want to anchor their plans, want to anchor their modules to be able to plan ahead and invest appropriately. Next slide, please. So again, in conclusion, Vision 2050 must be financed. That is clear. Not to be hoped for. And to be financed, capital must flow. There must be stability in our region. There must be clarity. The opportunity does exist. A renewed fiscal social contract will unlock trust and growth. And of course, strategic capital mobilization, partnership, engagement to power long-term success. And it's on this note that I end my presentation, but I think the central part of this is discipline. Discipline as to how we plan. Discipline as to how we attract the key people. Discipline and accountability as to how we use the resources. Thank you very much, and good morning.